Windows Troubleshooting Part 2. In this nugget, we continue our discussion of Windows troubleshooting, and this is Part 2, where we start by talking about printing. Now, we talked about printers in a previous nugget at great length, mostly relating to the physical device. Here we'll talk about that maybe a little bit, but mostly we're addressing how it interoperates with Windows and things we can do to assist troubleshooting problems there. We talk also about blue screens, which are those nefarious screens that you see sometimes when that just turns all blue and you have no way of interoperating with the operating system anymore, and then the system reboots. Makes for a really great day. We'll talk also about I/O problems. This is especially troublesome because that's how you interoperate with the operating system. So if you can't get any I/O, then what? We'll also take a look at what to do if the system locks up. This also, again, is frustrating because this prevents you from interoperating with the operating system as well. Then we take a look at services. Sometimes something just won't work, and if you look at the services, you'll see a service is not started. We'll address that, as well as background processes that can chew up system resources. And also we'll take a look at applications and how to help make sure that you can get them to run or install properly. Alright, so as we get started talking about assorted troubleshooting issues, we'll start here first with printing. And by the way, all these listed topics that I'm going to show you on these next few whiteboards pretty much come right out of the A+ exam objectives, so I just wanted to make sure that I don't leave anything out. And in fact, for the whole series that we're doing here, I make sure that I check mark off each A+ exam objective as we go so that I can make sure that we cover them all. Nevertheless, when it comes to printing, we've already addressed a lot of this when we talked about printing in an earlier nugget. That focused on the hardware, where we talked about using a maintenance kit, for example, to replace the fuse or the rollers. Maybe you had to replace toner, paper, all those sorts of things. However, here, when we're talking about assorted troubleshooting in relation to Windows, one of the things that directly interfaces with the printer is going to be the spooler itself. If you have problems with a stalled spooler, mostly you're going to be doing is just stopping it and restarting it. So, but you would do a net stop spooler, ampersand, net start spooler. This might be the case, for example, if you have a print job that's just kind of sitting there and you've got maybe a bunch of other print jobs backed up behind it and they're all waiting on a print job to finish, but it never seems to go anywhere. It might be that the print spooler has been stalled somehow, and by restarting it, that might help to give it a kick in the pants. And then we also have the services console where it'll be called print spooler here, and of course here you can also right-click there and restart. Another thing you'll experience sometimes here is when you're trying to print, but you have either an incorrect or incompatible driver. This sometimes is the case if you have, a certain model of a driver. Let's say it's a, Print Master 5000, but you don't really have the drivers on hand for the Print Master 5000. You only have the drivers for the Print Master 4000. Well, very often, you can print simple documents with that, but if you have to start doing something like duplexing, which only the 5000 supports, but the driver for the 4000 doesn't support, well, then you won't be able to have that feature. So you might be missing some of those kinds of features using the incompatible or incorrect drivers. If they're far off base and they're really not suitable at all, and you can't even get basic functionality out of them, frequently either it just won't print, or when it does print, it prints out total garbage. So that's very often what's going to happen if you have an incorrect or incompatible driver. And then for form printing, there's a number of things that can go on here. This is normally going to relate to properly operating the software. Depends on which program you use, but very often there's going to be a field that you will enter in, and it will interoperate with some kind of a database, maybe of names and addresses. Maybe you're printing out form letters or form envelopes and that sort of thing. And so very often that's going to relate to properly adjusting or working with that software product. And then there are other types of forms that you can work with here as well. You'll find those in Control Panel under Printer. And when we get into this, you can right-click here and go to Server Properties, or if you need to adjust any of the forms, you can go Run as Administrator, and then Server Properties. And once we get into this, you'll see then that in the Forms item right here, I can use existing forms that already exist, and these are kind of default items that you'll see for most print servers. And then I can also create a new form, and for that one, I would enter in the different dimensions. So for example, a lot of times I print on 13 by 19, so it'll be 13 inches wide by 19 inches high. This is for photographs that I spit out of an inkjet Epson, and so I just enter in those characteristics there and click OK. And then that's pretty much it. Now if I wanted to print that size, I could just go to my printer and then select that paper size out of one of my custom form options. A+ exam objectives also identify something called a blue screen. Now, Microsoft doesn't really like that term. They prefer that we use the term stop screen. I guess it's just a matter of semantics, but I call them blue screens, and so does everybody else. After all, they're blue in color. If they were actually stop screens, wouldn't they be red in color? Anyway, what this is when you have usually the operating system is running, and maybe you're trying to print to a new printer that you installed, and as soon as you click print, all of a sudden you get a blue screen with all kinds of gibberish on it, and it's going to usually create a memory dump at that point as well. Now, very often, this is going to be driver related, and you'll see it when you try to perform certain actions within Windows or on startup. Sometimes you cannot even get to a Windows desktop because during the startup process, it loads a driver that causes a blue screen. The best way to address this is normally to take that driver that you just installed and remove it or update or replace it in safe mode, because then it's not going to be loading that new, snazzy new driver that just created a mess. Instead, it's going to load just the safe mode drivers that I discussed in our last nugget. Also, there's I/O driver failure. This can be kind of frustrating because if it's an I/O device, think about what that involves: keyboard, mouse, and video. Well, if you're having trouble with one of those devices, you really can't even interoperate with the operating system. So there's not a whole lot you can do, again, unless you go to safe mode. Once you've gone to safe mode, then, that's where you can take a look at the driver and replace it, or you can also replace the device. So those are a couple of your options. Maybe it's a fancy new keyboard that you've installed, and it's got all kinds of extra little buttons on it that run multimedia and stuff like that. Well, if your version of Windows doesn't support that, it might not be able to properly identify it, although most keyboards and mouse will at least be able to drop back to a standard kind of a generic driver, and you should still be able to get most functionality out of them. And then finally, most of the I/O devices, such as keyboards and mice and drawing pads like I'm using here to make all my chicken scratch on the screen here, those are very often connected through USB ports. Rarely do you see those on PS2 anymore. So one thing you want to check is to go back into BIOS and make sure that if you're having problems with those devices, that the USB has not been disabled in the BIOS. And you might not be booting into Windows. Perhaps you're booting into maybe a vendor's CD for antivirus or image restoration, one of those types of things. Well, you need to make sure that the BIOS is configured to enable USB even before Windows operating systems load, because otherwise you'll have no way to control the I/O for those programs that you're loading. Other kinds of assorted troubleshooting problems you might experience relate to system lockup. This, again, is a pretty frustrating thing because since the system is locked up, that means that you have no ability to interoperate with the computer. Your keyboard won't work, your mouse won't work, and that's your primary method for communicating with the operating system. So if that's the case, not really a whole lot you can do. One thing I would recommend, though, is I would wait a few minutes, especially if the hard drive light is on. Now, if it's just staying steady on for several minutes, then it's probably caught in some kind of a loop that it can't get out of. However, if you see it flashing and varying in intensity, or if you see the hard drive spinning sometimes and then not spinning and so forth, it might be waiting on a very resource-intensive task to finish, and it might not truly be locked up. So if you wait just a few more minutes, and how many minutes, who knows, it just depends on how long your patience is. But if you wait just a few more minutes, you might find that the keyboard and mouse get released. But otherwise, and that, by the way, would not be a true system lockup. That would just be that the system was very busy. A true system lockup means that there is no opportunity for keyboard or mouse input, and you're just plain shut out. And if that's the case, you really don't have any other option. You're going to have to power off the machine. Because that's your only way of interfacing with the computer, is through the power button. No, actually, that's not true. I guess you could interoperate with a sledgehammer or the power button. 9 out of 10 respondents usually say they use the sledgehammer, myself included. Anyway, of course, when we're being reasonable, that's all you can do. Now, you could hit the reset switch instead on a desktop computer, but I normally recommend that you power off. There are some few devices out there that actually have switches in them that are mechanical switches that might not benefit from a reset. For example, I used to work with some old modems back in the day, and whenever they would open up the line to dial out, there was actually a clicking noise on the modem, and there was some kind of a switch in there that would open up. If we would just reset, it would never reset that little switch or whatever it was. So if we power it off, then it resets those switches, and I think it's normally going to be a better way to go. Leave it off for a few seconds, and then power it back on, and then you can at least start to attempt troubleshooting measures. Also check to see if you're running too many demanding apps. This is very much relative to the resources that you have and whether or not you're running 32-bit processors or 64-bit and so forth. But you might really be stretching those out. And so if you look at Task Manager or certain gadgets that I've talked about in previous nuggets, and you see that you're using 90% of your memory and your CPU utilization is at 80% to 90% all the time, it might just mean that you have too many apps running, or that the app that you have running is too demanding for Windows with your current hardware. Also check to see if there's any new drivers that you can update. This sometimes is also going to be useful because if the driver is kind of twitchy or unreliable, it can also cause the system to lock up. Now, if you have certain services that fail to start, one of the things you can check out there is dependencies. Remember when we looked at services in an earlier nugget, I'll just take a look at whatever this print spooler that we were looking at earlier. Remember when we looked at an earlier nugget, we could see that there were dependencies here, so that if other services depended on the system, this service depended on the following system components, like these, and then if one of these services fails, then the print spooler could also fail. Also, if I'm trying to send a fax, but it doesn't seem to be sending, and the fax service seems to be working, but it still doesn't seem to be able to send a fax, then it could be that the print spooler is not working properly, because the following system components, the fax service, depends on the print spooler. So just check out these interdependencies to make sure that something is not preventing this service from starting up properly. Then also go to the startup mode. This again is something that we took a look at in a previous nugget, but just as a quick review, if you go to the properties of the service, notice the startup type here is automatic. If it's a service you use regularly, you probably want it to stay on automatic, and we discussed these earlier. But if it's not started, just click on start and then change it to automatic if you want it to do so all the time. And then finally, much like I showed you with the print spooler service earlier, you can do a manual restart of that service just to kind of clean out the cobwebs and give it a fresh start. And as we continue with our troubleshooting issues here, you might run into certain background processes problems as well. Now, there's a lot of things that run in the background, some of which you can identify and some of which you can't. I mean, if you take a look at processes here, most of these things that we're looking at are some kind of a background process. And I haven't memorized exactly what every single one of these things are, but I can recognize probably most of them. But the thing I want to keep in mind here is if I go to CPU and I sort them according to CPU utilization, then I can quickly identify things that might be using CPU utilization that I don't really know what that is. If that's the case, you can do something like a Google search for it, or check with your security vendor for your anti-spyware software or your antivirus software, and see if you actually have a piece of malware running back there. The reason why I point that out is because very often malware is very poorly written, and as a result, it may have memory leaks, which is where it will consume a certain amount of memory, and then it won't return it to the operating system when it's complete. That's true of both malware and any other software that's poorly written. And I absolutely prefer my malware to be properly written and graceful. Anyway, check that out. It could be an issue with that, and if your security software cleans that up, you might see that the system actually runs better. And then again, like I said, check that CPU utilization to see if a background process is causing that CPU to peg and just get way up high. Also, a lot of the background processes are default background processes, like I was mentioning earlier. Windows functions that continue to run and so forth. And so very often, if you're sure that they're not viruses or malware, they're usually just harmless and an important part of the operating system. And then we also have application issues. Now, we talked about applications in a previous nugget here as well, but I want to readdress some of those things here, specifically relating to troubleshooting. What you'll find is that on the A+ exam objectives, it talks about installation failures and or launch failures. I kind of put them in the same list here, and the reason why is because very often things that will prevent a proper installation are things in this list, and things that will prevent a proper launching of software are the same things in this list. Okay, just under the context of running the application. instead of installing the application. So for example, if we take a look at system requirements, if the software has been properly written, what should happen is when you try to install it, it looks at the operating system version. It looks at the amount of memory that you have installed. It looks at the amount of free space that you have and certain other parameters to make sure that the operating system environment is suitable for that software. But some software that's not well written or something like that very often will not properly check through those things, and it may still install even though it didn't really meet adequate system requirements. If that happens, you may have trouble launching that software because although it let you install it because it never checked through all the requirements, now it really won't launch, or it'll launch but it won't run very well because you don't have enough system resources. Another factor that could take part in that is that maybe you do indeed have enough system requirements for the installation. But then when you actually go to launch it, you've got a bunch of other applications multitasking, and now even though you've got 4 gigabytes of memory or something like that, you really don't have very much free memory at all because you have so many other applications running. And if that's the case, again, the application may fail to launch, although current Windows applications should still launch. They'll just use paging file instead of actual memory, but they may perform very, very poorly. Also, check to see whether or not administrator is required. I have some old applications that I use. In fact, let me just show you one of them. Is this Painter Classic. Let me double click that and open it up over here. Painter Classic is what I used to use for my whiteboarding instead of Photoshop. And you can see here that when I try to launch it, it says that it needs administrator credentials. Now, it never used to show me that, but I had to go to the properties of the shortcut for this application and force it to always run as administrator. Because if I were just run this the way it was without running it as administrator, then it would never run properly and it would give me all kinds of problems. And of course, that description relates mostly to the ability to launch that software, but you again are probably going to be required to be an administrator to install software in the first place, so just bear that in mind. Also check the compatibility tab, and as I go back over here to Windows Vista, I've gone to the shortcut properties for my Painter Classic. Here's where I specify run this program as an administrator, and that way it actually always does. But we also have these other compatibility items. Maybe it's optimized to run under a certain operating system that's an older operating system. And we've seen all these things in the past before. So just as a quick review, this very often will help you to run that software. Also, again, check the various visual capabilities here, and you might need to go through each one of these individually, checking them in order to see if the application will run, especially, of course, if it's giving you strange video issues. We can also check with updates. Very often an application will not install properly because you're running an older version that's not compatible with the newest Windows operating system that you're working with. For example, I've had some applications that installed just fine under Windows Vista, but when I upgraded to Windows 7, those applications would not install properly anymore. Now, some applications are very intelligently designed so that if they don't detect a proper installation, they may prompt you saying a new update of this software is available, would you like to download it? And so then you can attempt to do that to see if you can get that application installed. It may also be something in a Windows update kind of a format where there's a compatibility issue with known applications, and Microsoft may provide a shim or a fix that allows that application to then install. Also, do make sure that you close other applications. Not necessarily when you're launching an application. You should be able to multitask unless it's a really finicky application, but particularly in relation to installing applications. Very often that's recommended by the vendor anyway, so you may need to close those other apps at least temporarily. And then remember that 16-bit applications equals no. You cannot run 16-bit apps most of the time, although you might be able to use that utility, and I think I mentioned this in a previous nugget as well, that utility called DOSBox. And if you just go to DOSBox.com, it's a little application that will be kind of an MS-DOS emulator that allows you to run some of those older programs inside of Windows Vista and Windows 7 in particular. In this nugget, we continued our discussion of Windows troubleshooting with part 2. We started off by talking about printing, but really the first 4 topics here specifically, all of these could go wrong with bad drivers. And that could be a number of different symptoms, including, if you're printing, garbled output. Okay, so that's one of the things that we looked at there. If you have an unsigned driver, you're much more likely to get a blue screen, although we don't see those as much in Windows Vista and 7 because of the fact that we now have signed driver requirements. Could still happen, though. We also have I/O requirements as well. If you, again, have a bad driver, it may prevent you from being able to interoperate with the keyboard and the mouse. And then we looked also at system lockups. Sometimes this is just because the system has gotten too busy, but again, bad drivers could cause this as well. But sometimes applications will also lock up the system as well, and you might need to check to see what's been installed recently, or you might need to multitask less. We looked at services as well. Remember, you can restart those services, set them to start up automatically, a number of things like this. And we looked at background processes as well. Make sure that you're familiar with a background process that is extremely demanding on your system, because it might be some kind of malware. Otherwise, it might just be a normal Windows process. And we looked at applications as well and how to make them a little bit more compatible with Windows operating systems. Well, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.